I'd like to go ahead and kick off at least with the introduction. So folks who are trickling in will miss my first words of introduction, just to say on behalf of the Alliance for Peacebuilding that we're so grateful that you have decided to share this hour with us. You probably know that this webinar series is a part of an Alliance for Peacebuilding spring series on US peace, justice, and democracy, the working group that we have. And it's a series of webinars on preventing and reducing conflict and instability, specifically in the United States, and looking at shaping what's next. And I'm Julia Roig. I'm the president and CEO of a member organization of the Alliance for Peacebuilding, Partners Global. And I'm also proud and very privileged to be the chair of the board of the Alliance right now. So this series has been focusing on conflict dynamics in the US, those that are driving instability, extremism, toxic polarization, and most importantly, the political and policy challenges and initiatives that we need to build the society that we all want to be working towards for a just and secure and fair for all Americans. So today's conversation is co-convened as a part of the Partners Global Institute's New Horizons project, where we've also been exploring the intersections between peacebuilding and social justice, democracy, advocacy, and human rights. And we are so lucky to have three really prominent thinkers and experts and practitioners and leaders in their own spheres of influence. Nicole Argo is the Director of Research and Field Advancement at Over Zero, and Michelle Barsa is the Program Director of Democracy and Social Identity at Beyond Conflict. And Todd Lindberg is a Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute and an Adjunct Professor at Georgetown University. And so you have joined us for a topic on democracy narratives and sacred values. And in our little kind of prep discussion before launching into the webinar, we acknowledge that this is a really meaty subject. And our colleagues today are going to spend about 35 to 40 minutes sharing some research, sharing some thoughts that they have about this topic. But, you know, we're really only going to be able to skim the surface of what truly is a really important and complex topic of narratives and democracy, sacred values and norms. And so we're going to be sharing a lot of links during the session in the chat. Those will all be up on the Alliance for Peacebuilding website as well, because we really understand we're only giving you a taste and we want to point you to additional information that you'll be able to dig into the subject even more if you'd like to. So I'm going to frame very quickly the conversation. If any of you know me well, and I saw that there's some friends and colleagues that signed up for the session, I cannot stop talking about narratives. That is my issue. I call myself an evangelist now for narrative competency, because as someone who has been in the peace building and democracy building field for more than 25 years, I feel that this is a subject and a topic that is new in our toolkit, that is much more than strategic communications and storytelling, which all of us have been down that path as nonprofit leaders for many years. And so why democracy? All of you, again, decided to spend this time with us, democracy in the United States. We're worried about our democracy and our democratic institutions in this country. Freedom House, most recently came out with their 2020 report, and I'm going to read directly about their analysis of the United States, saying that in recent years, our democratic institutions have suffered erosion, as reflected in partisan pressure on the electoral process, bias and dysfunction in the criminal justice system, harmful policies on immigration and asylum seekers, and growing disparities in wealth, economic opportunity, and political influence. And I know that there are many of you from other countries in the world, your colleagues with us on this journey of working for democratic values around the world. And the United States traditionally has seen ourselves as a leader in this space. And there are others that are really acknowledging how is it that we are going to be promoting our global colleagues, governments around the world, extolling them to also really protect and work for democracy around the world when we're also really suffering our own challenges and democracy deficits? I think this actually could be a gift for us within the civil society community, the peace building community, the activist world, academics, because we have a lot to learn from each other now. And so I think you're going to hear not only about how research and thinking and theory and practice are coming out of the United States right now, because we're also learning from our colleagues overseas who have been dealing with these types of democratic deficits for many years, generations. So then, why are we talking about narrative then, the narrative of democracy? Because the concept of narrative really has been growing in prominence in the advocacy and social change space, because we do recognize that story is important for systemic change. But I do feel the need to describe a little bit what I mean by story. I saw that a lot of narrative experts signed up for this webinar. And so I feel a little bit sheepish defining narrative in front of so many of you that I really value the expertise and the research and the work that you do to promote narrative change. So I'm going to take just one definition, and it's from the Opportunity Agenda. It's an organization that I also really appreciate their work, and they talk about narrative as a big story. It's a big story that's rooted in shared values and common themes that influences how audience process information and make decisions. So narratives are conveyed and shaped not just in politics and policy discussions. They're in the news media, they're in popular culture, they're in social media, but they're also in symbols and in metaphors and at our dinner tables, the stories that we're telling each other about ourselves and about how we feel that the world works. Because finding the right big story for US democracy is so important right now, because we're engaging at the way that us and our citizens in this country are making sense of the world, how each of us think at our deepest subconscious levels about the way the world works. But we have to tap into that level of understanding in order to find the way that we're going to work on democracy together. Because it's not about clever messaging campaigns. It's about engaging what democracy means for us, why it's important, who is democracy for. We are really struggling right now because there's concepts of the big lie. Who has the truth? Words like freedom, patriotism, inclusion, pluralism, security, human dignity, social cohesion, community safety, all of these things have lived experiences underneath them, stories we tell ourselves, and a deep disenfranchisement history for people of color in the United States, and that we're really grappling with a history of racism and white supremacy. So while there are very different understandings of democracy at this subconscious level, we trigger an understanding with the words we use. Unity becomes a lightning rod for when we have our political discourse. Diversity becomes a calling card, supposedly, for a political belief system. We talk about belonging, but we got to figure out who belongs, who doesn't belong in this democracy, who has a voice. So this narrative engagement in a deeply divided society like the United States is not necessarily the divisions between left and right, conservative versus liberal, autocratic. We're really dealing with a difficult moment of really, do we want a democratic system of government? And we're called, therefore, to stay curious about each other as citizens. We have to interrogate our own worldviews and the stories we tell ourselves about our own identity, those who disagree with us, because in a healthy democracy, different points of view on policy are welcomed and should lead to better outcomes. And yet we're having a deep conversation about the institutional integrity, not just belief systems, but diversity of thought is our strength. And so while we may start to think that our political appointments are dangerous, when we have stories about power and power corrupting and needing to take back power, who has the power in this country, there is serious harm being done by the institutions in the United States right now in the name of democracy. And so this is why this topic of democracy narratives is so important. And so we're just going to give you a taste of the research around sacred values, about democratic norms that are driving our behavior, and that we jointly are going to start reflecting on. So thank you so much for spending this time with us. And it's just been a privilege to be reflecting on these topics with this particular group. And so with that, I am going to mute myself. I'm going to invite Nicole to introduce herself and kick us off. And we are going to have a quick moment of question and answer at the end. So I'm going to ask you to hold off on any questions, to please put them in the chat at the end. But if there are comments during any of our interventions, please go ahead and use the chat function. So Nicole, take it away.
Great. Thank you, Julia. And thank you to you and to Alliance for Peacebuilding and Partners Global for conceiving of the importance of this discussion today and then organizing it. It's really an honor and pleasure to be here. I am the Director of Research and Field Advancement at Over Zero. We are a nonprofit that works with different communities and institutions to build resilience to identity-based violence. And I guess I want to start by recapping Julia's last words, that something is broken in a democracy when we feel that our political opponents are dangerous, and when we've lost the ability to compromise and trust in our leaders and institutions. It's an excellent segue because sacred values, by definition, limit our ability to compromise. So let me start with a definition of sacred values. One way to think about them is as moral imperatives. These are imperatives linked to a value or stance that are so powerful they can sometimes drive human behavior irrespective of material goals or consequences. So let's start with an example. Imagine that right now I offered you $5,000 to sell your child, or if you don't have one, a sibling or a family member. I know that you're probably smiling, or this might seem silly because you know that I'm not serious, but role play with me for a moment and imagine that I was. If I were a person of means and motive, perhaps a representative of a state or a powerful non-state actor, and I really meant the offer. Will you sell me your child? I'll give you $5,000. How does that feel? I recognize that we are a year into a pandemic, and some of you have been home with your kids nonstop, and you might be choosing to negotiate for more money. No judgments, but I'm also going to guess that a lot of you didn't have that inclination, because having to sell one's child is not a tested value in mainstream America today, and certainly not one most on this call would have experienced. So instead, if you pretended for a moment that this was real, maybe you felt outrage or disgust. And if so, your children might be a sacred value for you. In research studies, emotions like moral outrage and disgust are associated with violations of sacred values. And if I had really offered to buy your child or family member, research says that you would probably also change in your behavior towards me. You might have cut ties by leaving the webinar or refusing to collaborate or negotiate or discuss any initiatives that grew from our discussion today. You might have sent an upset email to Julia, not to invite me back, et cetera, et cetera. So let me give you more context. In the social sciences, we think of sacred values that are processed in the brain as a moral rule. So this is something people act on as a duty or obligation rather than a choice, because they're not really a choice in terms of their brain processing. They're literally processed in the brain differently than a normal value and in different places. So if I ask myself, should I go to college close to home because I value my family, or far away because that's the best school, I'm actually here in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. It's a place where we deliberate, we weigh the costs and benefits of a decision. But if you ask me to sell my daughter, my brain is processing here in the left temporoparietal junction and here in the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. These are areas associated with rule-based behavior and the inhibition of inappropriate behaviors, respectively. There's no deliberation, that's just reaction. My brain knows that I shouldn't break the rule, and it feels like I might, or I'm being asked to. I'll probably be enveloped in anger, shame, moral outrage. And that'll happen implicitly. It's outside of my conscious awareness. So what does that mean in real life? It means that if you treat my sacred value like a regular value by offering me money or marketplace trade-offs in a negotiation, or if you attempt to argue with me about why my value is wrong, my brain will likely see it as a moral rule violation, and your effort will backfire. In research conducted in laboratories and all around the world, the holder of the sacred value gets angry or outraged, leaves the engagement, or becomes aggressive. Now, people can sacralize all sorts of things. It could be Jerusalem, the right of return, nuclear power in Iran, the journey to Mecca, being involved in the Vietnam War, taking care of one's parents, immigration stances, accountability for January 6th, gun rights, you name it. We know a bit now about when and why people sacralize issues. Arguably, the most significant factor is threat. So values don't tend to become sacred, or at least we don't recognize them as such until they're under threat. So if I had opened this talk asking, what are your sacred values? Most of you probably wouldn't have thought to say, not selling my child, because in this time in our country, it's not a threatened value. But what is really important to note is that threat doesn't have to be real. So often, and we're all too aware of it these days, threats can be constructed through public narratives, whether through media, politicians, or other sources. And as long as people perceive that they're threatened, then they act like it. Another thing that causes people to sacralize their values is our sense of who we are based on social identity. And there's two things that matter. The first is our sense of when our sense of who we are becomes fused with or subsumed within a group, could be political, racial, religious. Once we are fused with a group that cares a lot about a value, the more likely we are to sacralize it. This could be because of social norms, those unwritten rules and expectations within our social groups for how we should act or behave. Group norms often predict our behaviors even more than our individual attitudes or beliefs. But another thing that causes people to sacralize issues in studies is social rejection. And this could be an experience that leaves them feeling insignificant or devalued. At the societal level, it could be a systemic experience with discrimination or marginalization. It could be a perceived experience. So we see a lot of perceptions of minority group favoritism in America today. And there's many other things that are perceived that may not be a threat now or in the future, et cetera. Again, perceptions matter. So people sacralize values when they think they're going to lose something that matters to them, when they think it matters to a group they care deeply about, and when they feel socially rejected. There are a few other things that have been shown to increase sacralizing behavior, like ritual or absolutist rhetoric. So we know that if you use the form of sacralization in your speech, people tend to respond with it. It's like call and response. And the outcome of that is losing the deliberation, the content. All right, so that's a lot on sacred values. But we're here today to talk about democracy narratives. And I wanted to report on some research we've done at Over Zero, along with our partners at the American Immigration Council, on immigration issues. We asked, how sacralized are they in the United States today? And what we learned is that they're very sacralized. So for each of 14 immigration issues we assessed, they were considered sacred by at least 34% of the population, and by people on the right and the left. The most sacralized issue in our survey was sacralized by 56% of the sample. This was family separation. So you either sacralized stopping it or continuing it. And the least sacralized issue was sacralized, as I said, by 34%, and that was sanctuary cities. So I just want to say that this itself is noteworthy. These are significant percentages. By way of context, a 2011 study with US citizens, Burns et al., had 44% sacralization for the issue of abortion. That included people for or against. That's obviously been one of our country's most contentious issues. We've also recently run a similar study in Hungary, where along with much of Europe, waves of refugees and immigrants in the past 5 years have made this topic salient. The Hungarian population is heavily anti-immigration. The top sacralized immigration theme, which was whether or not to preserve a white and Christian Hungary, was sacralized by 22% of the population, which is far lower than what we have. So even there, where there's a passion against taking in immigrants, but it's largely shared, we see lower percentages. So we can talk more about this, but one reason that we think sacralization is at a higher level here might be that Hungary hasn't experienced the levels of toxic polarization that we are. So remember that threat tends to predict sacralization, and Hungary's lower percentages in comparison to the United States might be due to the fact that this core belief for Hungarians is less threatened by other partisans. This helps to explain another finding in our immigration survey data, which was that more open and welcoming immigration stances were generally sacralized more than restrictive stances. For instance, the most sacralized open stance, which was to stop family separation, was held by 47% of the sample, while the most sacralized restrictive stance, to withhold public benefits to unauthorized immigrants, was only sacralized by 33% of the sample. And again, we think the reason for this has to do with threat, because when the survey was taken, there was a restrictive, demonstrably anti-immigrant government in power. It would thus make sense that people holding open stances would be more likely to sacralize them. And we would probably expect the same finding on the restrictive side now, though that has yet to be tested. So another thing we found, which I think is really important for today's discussion, is that there was a lot of crossover. While liberals generally sacralized open stances and vice versa for conservatives, there was significant crossover or issues where a significant proportion of conservatives sacralized the open stance and vice versa. A lot of conservatives sacralized stopping family separation or creating a pathway to citizenship for DACA recipients. They sacralized access to public benefits for anyone in the country, including unauthorized immigrants. On the flip side, 44% of those who sacralized withholding public benefits from unauthorized immigrants were liberal or left-leaning. So there are these issues where underlying value themes like do no harm or take care of Americans first bring conservatives and liberals together. Sacralization doesn't have to happen purely along partisan lines. Getting back to what Julia started with, and that's critically important to remember as we think about how we mobilize and bring people together across partisan lines. So, as you might expect, sacred values are often associated in the social science literature with political behaviors like activist mobilization or political violence. And in our study, we did find that open sacralization was associated with activism. Again, in the political context of a Trump administration that was tough on immigration. Restrictive sacralization was not associated with activism at that time, though we might hypothesize that it would be now. And then I guess lastly, since I just mentioned it's important to understand the value behind a sacred value, we tried to do that. So what's an example of this? Like in abortion, is the moral rule about abortion itself, or is it about a woman's self-determination over her body or the sanctity of an unborn life? This is a vitally important question because it asks us to look beyond the way a sacred value presents itself in a political context and instead probe the underlying value or the mental model of the people holding it. So we need to probe not just those issues that people in a democracy support, but how deeply do they support them and why? And we did that in our study by asking what was associated with open and restrictive sacralization. And we also did a lot of qualitative work. What we learned was that threat explained most of sacralizing behavior. In this case, for restrictive sacralizers, they were driven by perceptions of immigration-related security and economic threat, probably not a surprise. The next largest factor came from social identity and norms. So this applied to both open and restrictive sacralizer. And here, the more respondents thought that stances were central to membership in their political group, the more likely they were to sacralize it. Put another way, perceived norms were the strongest individual factor associated with sacralizing. And again, it was true for both open and restrictive sacralizers. So this is different than people just being liberal and conservative. It was being a member of that party and believing the issue was central to the party. People are responding in ways that they think liberals and conservatives think they should, perhaps even thinking there might be consequences if they don't, like being ostracized or socially isolated. And in our view, this underscores the power that media and political leaders have, since they provide the primary cues as to what our partisan groups find important. There were also, okay, we're hitting time. There were some other differences as well. So if you had a strong identity, well, I'm just going to skip past a few pieces of this and end up with, what does this mean for our democracy? So part of the story of democracy that we've lost is how to disagree, how to listen to someone whose views differ without casting them outside of our moral universe. And as Julia said, in a democracy, we're to expect difference and compromise and value and cherish people with different ideas, in part because we have other ties to them too. So for sacred values, the problem isn't sacralization per se, it's when we disagree about what we're sacralizing. And when we see people on the other side with absolute stances, we think that they dismiss or denigrate us, then we quit, we say you can't get anywhere with them, or we attack. You're inhuman, how could you treat children and families this way? And then they quit. So we lose our chance to dialogue and compromise. And sometimes we think, as Michelle will talk about, that we're further apart than we really are. There's a lot more to say, but I'm going to use that as my segue.
Thank you so much, Nicole. And like I said, this is such a meaty topic. There's so much to dig into. We put into the chat a lot of the research and reports that Nicole have mentioned. So please, look into those documents. And I am keeping note of some of the comments and the questions that you guys have been putting in the chat as we've been going along. So we'll try and get to those discussions at the end. But Michelle, why don't you go ahead and go next and talk a little bit about norms?
Sure. And I'll start exactly where Nicole left off on this perception that we're farther apart than we actually are. Beyond Conflict, about a year ago now, published a report called America's Divided Mind, which was based on research led by Dr. Samantha Moorberg at UPenn, looking at political polarization in the US, specifically affective polarization. So how much do I feel warmth towards my group or my in-group, and coldness or less warmth towards an out-group, right? So the scientists test for these things called meta-perceptions, perceptions and meta-perceptions, the meta-perception being, what do I think that you think about this issue? Or what do I think that you think about me, right? So a perception is my sort of snapshot of my belief, attitude, stance. But my meta-perception gets a little bit more at the stories we tell each other about what our perceived outgroup or perceived antagonists or enemies think about us, right? And when we do this with Democrats and Republicans, and we gauge specifically for perceptions and meta-perceptions of dislike and dehumanization, so how much do I think that members of the other party really perceive me as less than human, literally, you find that the Republicans and Democrats both believe that members of the other party dehumanize them more than twice as much as they actually do, right? So when we survey for actual positions on political issues, there's a ton of overlap. And then when you survey for the perceptions of where the other party stands, huge chasms emerge in terms of where people perceive the parties to be. And this is indicative of a rising trend over the last 50 years of increasing polarization that's now hit toxic levels and has become incredibly problematic in terms of achieving political compromise, like Nicole began to allude to. So here we are thinking about polarization. At Beyond Conflict, we try to translate research from the brain and behavioral sciences to practical applications. So we're thinking about polarization and what that means in terms of translation to intervention, and found ourselves wondering if it was actually the right ailment on which to focus, right? So when we talk about polarization, at least for me, I tend to think about two poles veering away from a neutral middle, right? So if we want to counter polarization or reduce polarization, maybe we want to try to get those poles closer together. At the same time, we have research coming out, for example, from VDEM Institute looking at American political parties that shows a pretty marked increase in adherence to authoritarian practice, rhetoric, and norms among the Republican Party in the US. So if you see that skew, and then we're still trying to get back to the middle, there's a question there of whether the middle is anywhere that we want to be or not. And so for us, with our strategic rethink, we said, okay, what we're going to do actually is position democratic norms as the North Star and look at the cognitive and psychological barriers that impede adherence to those norms, or that might be driving deviation away from adhering to those norms, right, in the US. So the common democratic norms you'll hear referenced in America: freedom of speech, minority rights, free fraud elections, judicial independence, you know them. But also beyond these specific democratic norms, often enshrined in law, we want to be thinking about the psychological underpinnings. So what enables strong adherence and equal application of democratic norms in a legitimate democracy? And these things are threefold, at least in my view. One is political tolerance, so the willingness to tolerate a range of diverse political views, obviously core to any healthy democracy, but not a great predictor of the extent to which people will support civil liberties protections for all groups, particularly groups that they perceive to dislike or dehumanize them. So also you want to see support for equal protection application of civil liberties across all identity groups, and a general willingness to participate in governance or an interest in civic engagement, which is tied to a couple of things like interpersonal trust and membership in voluntary associations, norms around reciprocity. But where we are with the political science and the study of democratic norms is typically looking at the intersection of three things: of situation and context, of laws and policies, and then of social norms and cultures. And historically, the science, the evidence is focused on the first two, on context and laws, to the detriment of acknowledging the importance of social norms and really defining how we might go about achieving holistic democratic legitimacy in a given nation. So that was really just since the 1950s and 60s that they started studying what they called like the rules of the game, and essentially the extent to which it mattered or not that citizens of a state would internalize democratic norms and really believe them, fuse them with their own personal and social identities, if that was even necessary, or if you could actually do it with laws and contextual cues alone. The research was mixed for a while there, but the more recent research shows that there's a strong correlation between how much democratic norms are internalized and levels of political tolerance specifically. So again, my willingness to tolerate diverse political views, particularly views that I might find abhorrent or drastically different from my own. So that brings us to say, okay, what's going on in America today then, right? One, on the importance of democratic norms and how much they're fused with our social identities, personal identities, but also on how sacred these norms are. And these aren't the same thing. To say that a norm is held as important and to say that it's held as sacred is not the same thing, but we can talk more about that later. So we wanted to dig in, again, looking at perceptions and meta-perceptions, to how members of parties, how important they hold certain norms to be, how much they perceive other members of their group to hold those norms as important, and how much they perceive the other party to be holding these norms as important or not. So under the leadership of Dr. Michael Pasek at the New School, Dr. Samantha Morberg again at UPenn, we tested our assumptions against 4 norms: against fraud-free elections, equal rights, abuse of power by government officials, and protections from political interference in law enforcement investigations. We asked folks, so it was about equal numbers of Democrats and Republicans in a representative sample of just over 1,000 Americans. We asked folks to rank these norms as not important at all, 1, to extremely important, 100, so a scale of 1 to 100. And we found that members of both parties ranked these norms as meaningfully important. So the Democratic mean was around 90 across all 4 norms aggregated, and then for Republicans around 87. So the actual difference in how important Democrats and Republicans hold these norms is about 3 points. So then we stepped back and said, okay, well, what do you think, if you think about an average member of your political party, how important do you think they hold these norms? And then when you think about an average member of the other political party, how important do you think they hold these norms? And what you find, yet again, is a drastic misunderstanding and misestimation of how far apart we are. When you ask members of each political party, of the Democrats and Republicans, to estimate how important members of the other political party hold norms, you see a 70-point difference in perceived positions. So again, this is a comparison of a 3-point actual difference to a 70-point perceived difference. And so that says, okay, well, this is confusing. And if we all generally hold these democratic norms as being important or fused with our social identities, then what factors into these decisions about whether or not we equitably apply to these norms, if we adhere to them, or when we support violations of those norms or violate the norms itself? And here's where we come back to a lot of what Nicole was not just saying about threat and intergroup perceptions of intergroup threat, but also about stories, the stories that we tell ourselves. And when we built into this research study a measure for in-group bias, we found that the more inaccurate or biased participants were in their meta perception, so how much I misperceive a member of the other party holding a democratic norm as important, the more willing they were to violate democratic norms themselves. Okay, so this is important. So this means that even if I hold a norm as important or potentially sacred, if I perceive members of an antagonistic group or an out-group generally to be violating that norm, suddenly it elevates in importance for me. It can potentially become more sacred, though we need to test for that more explicitly. We also found that among Republicans, biased meta-perceptions also predicted greater approval of the Stop the Steal movement and the Capitol riot, which is interesting. I guess I bring this up to say that we often talk about sacred values vis-a-vis individual values. The emergent research, particularly the work led by Nicole, shows us the extent to which group norms that are seen as central to shared identities can dictate and correlate how much values are sacralized. And we have to start to think more intentionally about what that means vis-a-vis social conflict in the US, right? So if I'm a group that perceives myself to be under threat for any variety of reason, could be that I think the other group thinks I'm not moral enough, if they think that I'm not good, if they're violating a norm or behavior that I perceive to be as sacred. Sometimes you can see changing demographics as a potential loss of social status, which can be received as a threat, as an identity threat. What goes on for me is that literally affects the ways in which my brain processes information and the salience of different identities for me. So if I perceive a particular identity to be under threat, so for example, I'm an Arab. So if I'm witnessing anti-Arab discrimination around me, suddenly the salience of my Arab identity, although it sits among many identities that I hold, elevates in importance. Okay, so as my identity that's under threat elevates in importance, I have a greater tendency to perceive the outgroup as disliking or dehumanizing me, which means, again, I'm going to hunker down with the group that I identify with, my in-group. And when I do this, and when I increase my affinity and connection with my in-group in conditions of threat, I have a reduced likelihood that I'll challenge norms of the group. And your brain is programmed to do that. These norms keep you safe. They reward you with social belonging. They allow for the functioning of social safety nets and social protection systems. So suddenly, even though I find norms of that group to be problematic, I have a reduced likelihood or interest in questioning those norms. And then there's a whole slew of things that follow. Okay, I gotta stop. So I'm gonna wrap this up by saying, what we tend to do in thinking about democracy and democratic norms is to defer to context and to think about legal strategies and policy-focused strategies. We think less about what it means to move and evolve a culture, social norms, and we certainly think even less about distinguishing between sacred and utilitarian values and what that means for the way that we approach peace building in this country. And we often focus on what's tangible in the information environment, whether that's traditional media, social media, political rhetoric. And so on the production side of these sort of catalysts of polarization, and far less on the consumption side, which is where I would argue we need to be focusing now. What's going on for individuals and groups cognitively, psychologically, neurobiologically, that is ultimately impeding our ability to achieve democratic legitimacy in this country.
Great. Thank you, Michelle. Once again, a lot there, and Todd is gonna bring us home a little bit to say how this is all affecting our actual behavior and the reality of the lived experience right now in democracy in the United States. So go ahead, Todd.
Thanks, Julia, and thanks to Nicole and Michelle for two extremely stimulating, very rich presentations. I think I've even heard some of this before. I still think that there's more than we can process in the course of this hour, and maybe for a lot longer than that. But let me just try to put a few things on the table in addition, just to make matters either clearer or more complicated. I'm not sure which is most desirable at the moment. But I'm a member of Democracy Fund's Voters Study Group, and this is a bipartisan, nonpartisan, I suppose, collection of pollsters, analysts, data crunchers, etc. And we've done several major surveys of American opinion called the Voter Survey, and then we also did a survey known as Nationscape in conjunction with UCLA, which was a weekly tracking poll leading up to and after the election last year. And let me just tell you the things that have kept me up at night from these various surveys. And it's especially germane to a webinar convened by the Alliance for Peace Building. The problem is that an increasing number of people, it seems, take the view that if they don't get the electoral outcome they want, that violence may be justified. And this is alarming. I mean, how much is violence justified, the question asks, if your party loses? To me, the correct answer to that is not at all. But some people are saying there's a great deal of justification. There's some justification. And, these are not majority positions. These are fringe positions. And if you look at the people who express them and some of the characteristics that underlie them, you'll find them as the outliers in the parties. But all of this, I think, plays directly into some of the issues that both Michelle and Nicole are talking about. These are people who are feeling threatened and alienated and detached from the system. Now, what do we do about this? Well, I mean, I think that we need to, of course, expand the elements of dialogue. But I also think that, as we're hearing from Nicole and Michelle as well, there can be limitations on exactly how easy that is to do. It can be very difficult if you're trying to, if there's a particular function of the brain that is involved in some of these issues, rather than merely what we would like to think would be involved with this, namely sweet reason. Then we really have to think about how best to address these kinds of problems. And I think that one of the things that we should also not sell ourselves short with regard to these kinds of questions. I found the events of January 6th to be about as disturbing as anything I've seen in this country in my lifetime. But at the same time, we also had a very robust response, I think, in terms of finding people who violated the Capitol and arresting them and charging them. And that is a process that is now underway. So we have some sources of resilience here, in addition to the current stresses that we're under. And I don't think we should undersell them. I don't think it's a country on the brink. I think that if we puts our minds to it and really try to tackle these questions, that we may actually make more progress on it sooner than we think. Now, obviously, this has been a year of critique. This has been a year in which the practices in the United States have been held up to the supposed ideals of the United States. And the practices have been found quite rightly to be wanting. And I think that's been an important experience for a lot of people, including people who hadn't really been thinking about the question in those terms. But I also think that that the answer to this does not lie in readjusting our ideals to bring them in conformity to our practice. That would be one way of eliminating the hypocrisy in the system. But that's not the one that I think that we're especially interested in working on. We're working on bringing our practice more into alignment with our ideals. And I would say that this has been a process that has been ongoing in the United States of America since the founding and even before. The founding document, the 1776 Declaration of Independence, doesn't say all human beings are created equal. It says all men And you know what? That's what they were talking about at that particular time. However, underlying it was a principle that people could use to say, what do you mean just men? Or what do you mean just white men in this instance? And by applying, I think, a principle that was embodied in a way in the Declaration to the society, social practice more broadly, a critique developed that eventually was effectual in bringing about change and broadening the democratic basis of this country. And I think that principle is still in action. I think the ways in which the ideals are articulated is sufficiently broad to allow us a lot of latitude to address these other problems that we've seen. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the polarization phenomenon, and I would like to connect that a little bit to new media. You know, it used to be if you were the most extreme person in, say, a million, you were fairly socially isolated in the United States. Now we have media that enable you very easily to find the 330 or so people who are just as extreme as you are on that particular position. And this is new. This is not something that was apparent in historical contexts previous to this current media age. And I think it is problematic. It does drive discourse to extremes. But again, as Michelle has noted, it's not merely a story about how people are being driven to extremes in what they think. Certainly, there are people who profit from the noise, who find no reason to modulate an opinion when there are rewards for expressing it in its most extreme form. But that's not most people. And the rest of us, I think, at least to some degree, still have things that we can do to continue conversations with each other. Now, Nicole has, of course, pointed to a problem here, which is this sort of perception of threat that leads us to, I mean, I think before we talked about sacralization, sometimes we talked about doubling down or something like that. And now if we want to think about it as an addition to a process of thought as a biochemical process as well, you can see that it becomes an even more challenging thing to try to deal with. But I think it is possible to deal with it. And I think that we all have a responsibility, for example, to begin on our own biases with regard to these kinds of questions. And so I really wanted to draw attention to an article that I found to be extremely interesting. It's called Dangerous Speech and Dangerous Ideology, an integrated model for monitoring and prevention. And it's by Jonathan Maynard and Susan Benish. And what makes speech dangerous? This is the question. And I think that they offer some interesting ways that are helpful to think about. There are two questions here, central questions. One is the context, and one is also the content. So the context is who's the speaker? What authority does that speaker have? What is the social historical environment in which the speaker is speaking? What are the means by which the message is being disseminated to others? And what exactly is the audience? And how you answer those questions has a lot to do with how much danger is associated with particular speech. If there's a particular social historical context that creates in which a division has persisted and a especially well-respected speaker begins to either speak in violent terms or to justify those who might be choosing to act violently, you have a potentially volatile situation. And then the authors also identify 6 content patterns. And we've talked a little bit about some of them so far. One of them is dehumanization. You know, are you in the habit of referring to people with whom you disagree in terms that are other than human? I mean, are they cockroaches? This is a traditional prelude to genocide in the historical context. And it need not be as extreme as cockroaches, but you know, have you othered people to such a degree that they no longer assume to share basic elements of humanity? Another content area is guilt attribution. Who's really responsible? The question gets asked. Aren't these people actually whom we're this outgroup we're talking about? Haven't they actually been perpetrating crimes against us? Aren't we the victims here? Aren't they the guilty parties here? These are questions that people ask. And I say, both in relation to dehumanization and this and the others that I'll talk about, if you hear people doing this in the course of a conversation, be wary, because they are going someplace that they probably have no business going. In the first place, we're actually talking about other human beings. Human beings are not cockroaches. In the second place, guilt attribution has very little to do with actual guilt or innocence. It's rather a kind of convenient mode of collecting and ascribing blame to a particular group of people, whether there is any truth to the matter or not. So if you hear these things going on, ask yourself, I mean, how do people know this? Are they reading the minds? Do they have crystal balls? Do they have sort of mystical powers of insight or astral projection that enable them to go places, that enable them to see things that are not visible to the ordinary human eye? I don't think they have those powers. So, I mean, these sweeping generalizations of the kind we're talking about here are very dangerous. Threat construction is another area our authors point to here. Not only are they guilty of having attacked us before, but they're going to be a threat in the future. And also, destruction of alternatives. Unless we take a hard line with this particular group of individuals now, it's going to get worse. It's going to get out of control. Again, listen to people. Listen to the people on your side who make arguments of this kind. You'll hear it. And I think if we were a little more sensitive to it altogether, we might even be able to get ourselves in a position to call it out a little bit more and say, what are you talking about? What do you mean we have no alternative? And what do you mean we must act now and that what we need to do? And by the way, this is research that's often been done in the context of conflict situations around the world. I've spent a fair bit of time working on atrocity prevention policy over the years. But atrocity prevention and peace building begin at home as well. This is not something that we can be complacent about, I don't think, and particularly in this time of rhetorical, at a minimum, polarization in the extreme. Our authors also identify virtue talk. Only we are the only ones who have virtue here. We are the only ones who mean well. The others have bad motives. So it's as if they've been able to read the minds of the people whom they're criticizing, which they can't do. You can't really do that. And then, of course, future bias. Again, this kind of time is not on our side. The danger is only gathering. We must act now. This is also very, it's now or never. The entire future of the United States of America and the course of all that is good is on the line right now. Well, it probably isn't. It's likely that that this is not our last opportunity, and that by viewing matters as sort of our last opportunity, we're just asking for more trouble. So I want to. I think there's a link to this very important and useful article that's gone up in the chat, and I hope you'll all take a moment to look at it. I think it's very useful. And let me just, I know we're running out of time, and Julie's going to put up her hand if she hasn't already. But there we are. Okay, so thanks very much. It's been a great opportunity to share some of these thoughts with you.
Thank you so much, Todd. And I knew this was going to happen. I knew the hour was going to fly by, and we're all zoomed out. So I didn't want to take an hour and a half of your time. And yet that means that we're kind of ending a session where there's been lots of really excellent comments and the questions that I'm just going to have to summarize now. And I am going to invite you to continue in this dialogue with us. So here's my summary of kind of some observations and some questions and some final thoughts. First of all, the reason that we're talking about narratives and our cognition is because it ultimately becomes tactical for the structural reform that we want to achieve. We all have to then also help to activate our citizens, our coalitions. We have to build partnerships. We have to find a way of working for structural change. And there are, to Todd's last point about the urgency, and I love the article that he shared and all of the ways it makes us be self-reflective. And yet there are movements in this country that are saying we can't wait because our lives are at stake. And so to the extent that in solidarity, with people of color, with immigrant communities, with those who really are on the front lines of the receiving end of the lack of those civil liberties, there is a sense of urgency. And yet this idea of like assuming the motives and that for those who are supposedly of a different political ilk than ours, or a different identity, that they aren't going to be allies, I think is one of the tactical problems that we're falling into right now. And so part of the reason we're trying to find these narrative entry points into self-reflection about our own tactics and the way that kind of our either our national discourse, but our personal discourse and our personal interactions are unfolding, is because tactically there is a need for dealing with systemic change in this country right now, and that we're all going to be a part of that. And so Dana put a question as well in the chat about, well, what does this mean for peace builders? Are we called to be neutral? Are we called to just promote dialogue of understanding because we're not that far apart? I hope that's not the message that you are hearing from this discussion. We are a part of a movement. We are all a part of a larger movement with regards to the democracy in our country. And that movement requires us to understand how we are thinking about our own identities in all of the various complexity that means. And so that I don't think it's an either or. This is another tool in our toolbox. This is another way of thinking about ourselves and our work and our allies and how to make change. Because if we're narrating democracy, this was another question that Ham asked us, like, well, how do we narrate democracy? Well, democracy isn't a thing in and of itself, like civil society. I talk about civil society anymore. Like, what does that even mean? What does democracy mean? It has to deliver for human beings. And so we have to get to a place where we're talking about things that matter to each of us, assuming the best intentions that they actually also have a lived experience different from our own, but that we're finding that shared future. And so narrating democracy isn't really the challenge. It's the way that we're going to find that shared future and then get to a place in our brains where we're actually ready to deliberate and have differences of opinion and different lived experiences, really committed to the systemic change that we need. And then finally, Peter asked about competing values. Like, what if during Nicole's session, he said, you know, there's a lot of different elements to all of our identities. And that's the last thing that I'm going to leave you. Narrative competency means that we have to complexify the story. We have to allow for all sorts of different sacred values, different norms, different lived experiences, different parts of our identities. And we have to find a place where all of those full identities can be a part of our movements, our conversations, allowing for the differences and the conflicts, because we're not super rational. Some of these are, you know, competing stories in our heads. And so that's how I at least am trying to live my own practice, is to remember that none of this is black and white, and that our main job with regards to narrative competency is to seek out complexity with curiosity. So wow, that was really unsatisfying to have to stop after just an hour, because there's so much more to talk about. But I just want to say a big thank you to Nicole and Michelle and Todd for your wisdom and your sharing and your time, the rest of you as the audience. Count on us at the Horizons Project and the Alliance for Peace Building to continue to convene these important conversations. And please tune in next week, May 12th. There's going to be a really great conversation about reimagining public safety. So thank you all very much. We look forward to staying in touch. And please follow these three smart people, because they will have a lot more smart things to say in the future. Thank you all.